In the spring of 1244, high in the mountains of southern France, a choice was given. After a brutal 9-month siege, the last great fortress of a rebel faith had finally surrendered. Inside were the last leaders of their church, the men and women they called the Perfects. The victorious army of the French king gave them an ultimatum: renounce your faith, accept the authority of the true church, and you will be spared. They were given 2 weeks to consider the offer. At the end of that time, on a cold March morning, over 200 men and women walked out of the fortress. They had made their choice. They walked down the mountain, and without being pushed or chained, they voluntarily entered the great bonfire that had been prepared for them, choosing the agony of the fire over a life of compromise, an act of mass martyrdom that has echoed through the centuries. What was this faith? What belief could be so powerful, so absolute, that it could lead hundreds of devout souls to calmly embrace such a terrible death? This was the final, defiant act of the Cathars, a lost religion that believed the material world was hell, and that this death was their true salvation, their final, glorious release. To understand what brought them to this field of fire, we must go back to a time before the Crusade, when their faith was not a hunted remnant, but the vibrant, respected heart of a tolerant and brilliant culture, and discover the secret of the last perfect. To understand the conviction that led those men and women to the fire, we must leave the tragic peak of Montségur and travel back in time more than a century to the world that gave birth to their faith. This was not the grim, austere France of the northern kings. This was the Languedoc, a land with its own language, its own proud nobility, and its own unique, sun-drenched culture. In the 12th century, the Languedoc was one of the most sophisticated and cultured regions in all of Europe. This was the land of the troubadours, poets and musicians who perfected the art of courtly love. Its cities, like Toulouse and Albi, were centers of trade and learning, and its powerful counts and viscounts ruled with a spirit of proud independence, fostering a society that valued poetry, debate, and personal honor. This spirit of independence extended to matters of faith. While officially Catholic, the power of the church here was weak, and its local priests were often seen as corrupt, worldly, and ignorant. This created a spiritual vacuum and a remarkable atmosphere of religious tolerance. Unlike in other parts of Europe, new ideas were not immediately seen as a threat. They were something to be discussed, debated, and considered. It was a society where personal conscience was held in high regard, and it was in this fertile soil that a new, radical, and compelling vision of Christianity was about to take root, not as a hated heresy, but as a respected choice. The spiritual landscape of the Languedoc was not just defined by tolerance, but by a deep and growing dissatisfaction with the established Church of Rome. In theory, the Catholic clergy were meant to be models of piety and poverty, but in reality, many of its bishops and abbots were little more than powerful feudal lords. They amassed great wealth, played political games, and lived lives of open luxury that seemed to mock the simple teachings of Christ. This worldliness at the top had a profound effect on the flock. The local parish priests were often poorly educated, sometimes barely literate themselves, unable to preach a compelling sermon or answer the deep theological questions of their parishioners. For many, the rituals of the church, the Latin Mass they could not understand, the sacraments performed by a disinterested priest, began to feel like empty, mechanical gestures, a hollow shell where a living faith, should have been. This created a profound spiritual hunger among the people. The nobility, the merchants of the growing towns, the women who ran complex households. These were sophisticated people who yearned for a faith that spoke to their intellect and to their hearts. They wanted a religion that felt authentic and personal, one that could explain the difficult problem of evil and suffering in a world that was often brutal and unjust. And they were not finding it in their local parish church. This was the great spiritual vacuum of the Languedoc. The Catholic Church had, in many places, lost its moral authority. It preached poverty while living in wealth. It demanded piety while engaging in politics. And it offered rituals when the people craved understanding. This failure created a perfect opportunity for a new kind of priest and a new kind of church to rise and capture the hearts and minds of the people, not by force, but by offering a compelling and righteous alternative. At the heart of the faith that flourished in the Languedoc lay a radical and powerful answer to the oldest question in religion, the problem of evil. Though their specific beliefs could vary from one valley to the next, their enemies in Rome saw them as a single, monstrous heresy, and they gave it a name: Catharism. For the Cathars, if a single, all-powerful God created the world, why is it so full of suffering, of disease, decay, violence, and death? They looked upon the world, and they concluded that the premise of the question was wrong. The God who created this world could not possibly be the true, good God. They taught that there were not one, but two gods, locked in an eternal struggle. The first was the God of the Old Testament, the wrathful, jealous creator who demanded sacrifice and laid down arbitrary laws. They saw this being not as the father of Jesus, but as a lesser, evil power, a demiurge, whom they sometimes called Rex Mundi, the king of this world. He was the proud and ignorant creator of all that we can see and touch. And if the creator was evil, then his entire creation, the physical, material universe, was also fundamentally evil. It was not a paradise that humanity had lost. It was a prison that our souls had been tricked into entering. Every star, every mountain, every animal, and every human body was made of this flawed, corrupting matter, a cleverly designed trap built by the evil God to ensnare the divine sparks of light, the angelic souls that had fallen from the true heaven above. This belief had profound ethical consequences. If the body and the material world were an evil prison, then one's goal was not to sanctify the flesh, but to escape it. Procreation, which creates new bodies and thus new prisons for more souls, was seen as a terrible act of collaboration with the evil God. Eating meat, the flesh of other ensnared souls, was forbidden. And the pursuit of worldly power, wealth, and status was seen as nothing more than a fool's errand, decorating the walls of one's own cage. But the Cathars did not believe the universe was only a prison. They taught that far beyond this corrupt material world, there existed another realm, a heaven of pure, perfect, and immaterial light. This was the home of the true God, the good God of the New Testament, a being of pure spirit, love, and compassion, who had absolutely no part in the creation of the flawed, physical world. He was a stranger to this universe, and his kingdom was our true home. Because this good God could have no contact with corrupt matter, his great messenger Jesus could not have been a man of flesh and blood. The Cathars taught that Jesus was a pure spirit, an angel who only appeared to have a human body, a phantom sent on a divine rescue mission. His purpose was not to suffer and die on a physical cross to atone for sin was merely a consequence of being trapped in matter. His purpose was to be a teacher, to deliver the secret knowledge that would allow our souls to escape their fleshy prisons. The secret knowledge, the gnosis, that Jesus brought was simple and profound. He taught that we are not the sinful creatures of an earthly God. We are angels, divine sparks of light who, long ago, were tricked or tempted into falling from the realm of light and became trapped in these bodies of flesh created by the evil one. He taught that the material world is a cycle of reincarnation, where souls are repeatedly reborn into new bodies, new prisons, forgetting their divine origin with each new life. This, then, was the core of the Cathar faith. It was a religion not of faith in a historical event, but of knowledge of one's true, divine nature. Salvation was not achieved by believing in Christ's resurrection, or by participating in the sacraments of a worldly church. It was achieved by understanding, by receiving the secret gnosis of who you truly are, and then by living a life of extreme purity and detachment from the material world, breaking the cycle of reincarnation and finally allowing your soul to return to its home in the realm of light. But how did our divine souls, these sparks of heavenly light, end up in this prison of matter? The Cathars had a myth for this, a story of a great rebellion and a terrible betrayal. They taught that in the beginning, a great war was fought in heaven, but it was not a war of swords and angels' wings. It was a war of deception, waged by the evil God against the children of light. This evil God, Satan, or Rex Mundi, was a creator, but he could not create life itself. He could only build the cages, not the birds. And so he went to the very border of the kingdom of light, and he began to tempt the angels who stood guard there. He promised them power. He promised them beautiful bodies of flesh and passion. He promised that they could be kings and queens of their own little worlds, if only they would follow him. Tempted by these false promises, a third of the angels of heaven followed the Dark Lord, willingly leaving the realm of spirit and descending into his newly formed material world. But once they arrived, the betrayal was complete. The beautiful bodies he had promised became prisons of corrupting flesh. Their memories were wiped clean, and their connection to the good God was severed. They had become the first human souls, trapped in a world of decay and condemned to the weary cycle of reincarnation. This myth is the key to the entire Cathar worldview, for it is at once profoundly pessimistic and profoundly hopeful. It means that the human condition is a tragic mistake, an imprisonment. But it also means that our true nature, our deepest essence, is not sinful or flawed. It is purely and magnificently divine. We are not fallen humans struggling to be good. We are fallen angels, struggling to remember that we are already perfect, and the entire purpose of our existence is simply to find our way home. This unique worldview, with its evil creator and its spectral phantom Jesus, meant that the Cathars had to reject some of the most fundamental tenets of the Catholic Church. For them, many of the Church's most sacred symbols and beliefs were not just wrong. They were traps, deceptions created by the king of this world to keep souls bound to the prison of matter. The most shocking of these rejections was their view of the cross. For the Catholic world, The cross was the ultimate symbol of Christ's loving sacrifice and humanity's salvation. But for the Cathars, it was the complete opposite. Since Jesus was a spirit and had no physical body, he could not have been physically nailed to a piece of wood. Therefore, the cross was not a symbol of salvation. It was merely a symbol of the material world, an instrument of torture and execution used by the evil god's followers. To venerate the cross, in their eyes, was a form of idolatry, a bizarre worship of the murder weapon used by the enemy. Equally radical was their rejection of the Old Testament. Since they believed the Creator God, described in the book of Genesis, was the evil demiurge, it followed that his book was the scripture of the false god. They looked at its stories of wrath, of jealousy, of tribal warfare, and bloody animal sacrifices, and they saw not the word of the loving Father of Jesus, but the clear biography of the cruel king of this world. For the Cathars, the only true scripture was the New Testament, particularly the Gospels and the letters of Paul, which they believed contained the authentic, spiritual message of the good God. The Cathars understood that the life of extreme, world-denying asceticism required to escape the prison of flesh was not possible for everyone. Most people needed to work, to raise families, and to live within the material world. To accommodate this reality, they created a practical and brilliant two-tiered church, a structure that allowed for different levels of devotion and provided a path to salvation for all. The vast majority of followers were known as crackdowns, or believers. These were the ordinary people of the Languedoc, the farmers, the artisans, the merchants, and even many of the local knights and nobles. The crackdowns were not expected to follow the harshest rules of the faith. They could marry, own property, and live a relatively normal life. Their primary role was to believe in the Cathar doctrine and to support and revere those who had chosen the harder path. That harder path was walked by the spiritual elite of the church, the men and women known as the perfects. They were the true priests and living saints of the Cathar faith, also known simply as the good men and good women. The perfects were those who had received the faith's single great sacrament, the consolamentum, and had embarked on a life of extreme purity and detachment from the material world. Their purpose was to travel, to preach, to teach, and to provide spiritual guidance to the believers. This created a powerful symbiotic relationship between the two groups. The crackdowns provided the perfects with food, with shelter, and crucially, with protection from the hostile outside world. In return, the perfects offered the people a living example of holiness, a direct connection to their faith, and, most importantly of all, the promise of salvation. For it was only a perfect who could administer the final, saving sacrament to a believer on their deathbed, a sacrament that would wash away all sins and free their soul from the prison of this world forever. To become a perfect was to embark on a life that was a complete rejection of the material world. The first step was a vow of absolute poverty. The perfects owned nothing, no land, no money, not even the simple dark robe they wore. They were itinerant preachers, traveling constantly on foot from village to village, relying entirely on the hospitality and donations of the crackdowns, the believers who sheltered and fed them. This stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the immense wealth and land ownership of the Catholic bishops. Their diet was another expression of their rejection of the flesh. They were strict vegetarians, but with a unique theological twist. They believed that any creature that was born from a sexual act was a product of the evil god. and so they abstained from all meat, eggs, cheese, and milk. Curiously, they did eat fish, which they, like many in the ancient world, believed reproduced asexually, and was therefore less tainted by the corruption of the material world. Their life was a constant, conscious effort to consume as little of the evil creation as possible. Their days were structured around prayer, meditation, and the study of the New Testament. They traveled in pairs, offering spiritual guidance and instruction to the communities they visited. But they were not idle monks, to avoid being a burden on their followers. Many perfects practiced a trade to support their humble lifestyle. They were often weavers, or tailors, or other skilled artisans, working with their hands and living lives of productive simplicity that earned them the admiration of the common people. But the most important vow, the cornerstone of their ascetic ideal, was absolute chastity. Since procreation was the primary mechanism by which the evil god trapped new angelic souls in the prison of flesh, the perfects saw it as the single greatest sin. To bring a child into this world of suffering was to collaborate with the enemy. Their celibacy was the ultimate act of rebellion against the king of this world, a refusal to participate in his corrupting cycle of creation, and a testament to their singular focus on liberating souls, not imprisoning them. While the Catholic Church offered its followers 7 complex sacraments, from baptism with water to the final rites, the Cathars rejected them all as creations of the evil god. They practiced only one sacrament, a single, powerful ritual that served as the gateway to salvation. It was known as the consolamentum, the consolation, and it was the central pillar of their entire church. The consolamentum was, first and foremost, the rite of ordination that created a new perfect. When a believer chose to renounce the world and embrace the ascetic path, they would undergo a long period of instruction and fasting. The ceremony itself was a solemn baptism of the Holy Spirit. The perfects would lay their hands, and the sacred text of the Gospel of John, upon the candidate's head, and through prayer, they would transmit the Holy Spirit, elevating the believer to the status of a living saint, a perfect. But this was the rare use of the sacrament. For most people, the consolamentum was something they hoped to receive only once, on their deathbed. When a credente, a common believer, felt their life was coming to an end, their family would urgently send for the nearest perfects. The good Christians would travel to the bedside and perform the gentle rite, an act that was believed to wash away all the sins committed during a lifetime in the material world. This was the profound promise of the Cathar faith, and the source of its incredible appeal. It offered a direct, personal, and certain path to heaven. There was no need to fear the fires of purgatory. There was no need for a worldly priest or a distant pope. Salvation could be delivered to you in your final moments, by a man or woman you knew and respected as truly holy, a final consoling act that ensured your angelic soul would be freed from the prison of the flesh and begin its journey home to the realm of light. The consolamentum offered a guarantee of salvation, but it also created a profound spiritual dilemma. It was most often given to a believer on their deathbed, when they were believed to have only hours or days to live. But what happened if a person received the sacrament, had their soul wiped clean of all sin, and then, unexpectedly, they recovered from their illness? According to Cathar belief, their soul was now perfect, but to return to a worldly life meant risking contamination, to eat food, To speak a harsh word, to sin in any small way, would be to pollute that perfected soul once more. This would require them to receive the consolamentum a second time before death, a sacrament that the traveling perfects might not be available to give. For some devout believers, this risk was simply too great to take. The solution to this dilemma was a controversial practice known as the Endura. It was a voluntary, ritual fast unto death. A believer who had received the final sacrament would, in some cases, choose to abstain from all food, and sometimes even water, until their body perished, ensuring that their soul would pass into the next life in its pristine, newly purified state, an unbroken vessel of light. This was not a common practice, but it was a path chosen by the most zealous of the faithful. Their enemies in the Catholic Church seized upon this practice, denouncing it as a form of demonic suicide, a mortal sin. But for the Cathars, it was the exact opposite. It was not an act of despair, but an ultimate act of piety and devotion, a final, joyful shedding of the hated prison of flesh. It was a way of ensuring that their angelic soul, now cleansed and ready, would not be delayed or risk falling back into the darkness. It was, in their eyes, the best possible end to a life, a good death. The Cathar faith was not a small, isolated sect, hiding in the wilderness. By the end of the 12th century, it had become a major popular movement. It had spread like wildfire throughout the towns and castles of the Languedoc, converting peasants, merchants, artisans, and, most alarmingly for Rome, a significant portion of the local nobility. From the perspective of the papacy, this was not a minor infection. It was a spiritual plague that was consuming one of the wealthiest and most strategic regions of Christendom. What made the threat so profound was that the Cathars were not simply disorganized heretics. They were organized. They had established their own bishops, with their own defined dioceses that mirrored and directly competed with the Catholic structure. They held public councils and debates, and their perfects moved with the confidence and authority of a true clergy. This was not just a rebellion against doctrine. It was a functioning, popular, and rapidly growing counter-church, built in the very heart of Catholic Europe. To build support for action, the Church in Rome began to portray Cathar beliefs not just as theologically wrong, but as a mortal danger to the very fabric of Christian society. Their rejection of oaths, it was argued, would destroy the feudal system that bound vassal to lord. Their rejection of procreation was twisted into a demonic, life-hating creed that, if allowed to triumph, would lead to the extinction of the human race. They were painted as a force of pure chaos and destruction. From the perspective of a powerful, centralizing papacy, this situation was intolerable. A rich and important part of Europe was, in effect, seceding from the Catholic world. Its nobles were protecting heretics. Its people were abandoning the sacraments. And its rival bishops were preaching a gospel of two gods. Peaceful attempts at conversion had failed completely. The stage was now set for a far more direct and far more violent solution. For the people of the Languedoc, the choice between the two faiths was often a simple visual contrast. On one side stood the Church of Rome. Its bishops were great lords who lived in palaces. Its monasteries owned vast tracts of land, and its priests demanded a tithe, a 10% tax on the labor of every farmer and artisan. The moral authority of the Cathar perfects, born of their absolute poverty, became so threatening that the Church was forced to imitate it, eventually creating its own orders of wandering, begging friars, like the Dominicans, just to try and win back the hearts of the people. They preached the virtue of poverty from within halls of great wealth. On the other side stood the Catha Perfects, the good Christians. They owned nothing but the simple dark robes on their backs. They traveled everywhere on foot, sharing the roads with the common people. They ate the simple food that was offered to them, and they often worked with their hands at a trade like weaving to support themselves. They preached a gospel of the Spirit, and they lived it with every waking breath. This was the great battle for the hearts and minds of the people, and the Cathars were winning. A nobleman or a town merchant could listen to a sermon about humility from a bishop dripping in gold and jewels, and then, that same afternoon, have a quiet, intelligent conversation about the nature of the soul with a Catha Perfect who had walked for days to reach his door and asked for nothing more than a piece of bread. The authenticity of the Perfects was their most powerful weapon. They didn't just preach the apostolic life of poverty, they lived it, and the people saw and respected the difference. Before resorting to war, the papacy made several concerted efforts to win back the Languedoc through peaceful means. It sent its best preachers, including the man who would become Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. Their mission was to engage the Cathars directly, to out-preach them, out-debate them, and to win the hearts of the people back to Rome through superior argument and a renewed example of piety. To this end, a series of great public debates were held throughout the region. These were major events, often presided over by the local nobility, where Catha Perfects and Catholic champions would argue the fine points of their theology for days on end before a captivated public. But the Catholic preachers quickly found themselves at a disadvantage. The Catha Perfects were masters of the New Testament. They were skilled speakers, and their simple, ascetic lives gave them an unshakable moral authority that the often worldly Catholic clergy lacked. But the ultimate failure of the debates was theological. The two sides were arguing from two completely different realities. The Catholics would base their arguments on the authority of the Old Testament and the Church Fathers. But the Cathars rejected the Old Testament as the book of the evil God, and they rejected the authority of a church they considered corrupt. There was no common ground, no shared foundation upon which a true argument could be built. It was an impossible impasse. The failure of the debates reached the ears of the man who sat on the throne of St. Peter, and he was not a man accustomed to failure. This was Pope Innocent III, arguably the most powerful, influential, and formidable pope of the entire Middle Ages. He was the embodiment of the papacy at the absolute zenith of its power, a spiritual leader who held sway over the kings and emperors of Europe, and who saw himself as the supreme shepherd of all Christendom. Innocent was not a decadent or corrupt pontiff. He was a brilliant canon lawyer, a masterful administrator, and from his own perspective, a deeply pious man. He genuinely and fervently believed that he was the vicar of Christ on earth, and that he possessed the sacred duty to protect the flock of the faithful from all threats, both external and internal. He saw the church as a single, unified body, and he would not suffer any part of it to become diseased. And from his perspective in Rome, the Cathar heresy was the most virulent disease imaginable. It was not just a disagreement. It was a direct assault on the foundations of the faith, a denial of the goodness of creation, a rejection of the sacraments, and a dismissal of the authority of the Church itself. In his eyes, The Cathars were not merely mistaken Christians. They were agents of darkness, a cancer growing in one of the most prosperous parts of his Christian world, and it had to be cut out for the good of the entire body. The Pope's chief instrument in the Languedoc was his papal legate, a man named Pierre de Castelnau, a zealous and unbending Cistercian monk. His mission was to force the local nobility to act, to compel them to confiscate the lands of heretics and drive the Cathar perfects from their territory. And his primary target was the most powerful lord in the region, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who was widely known to be tolerant, if not outright sympathetic, to his Cathar subjects. In January of 1208, the confrontation came to a head. Pierre de Castelnau met with the Count in his court. He publicly berated Raymond, accusing him of perjury, of protecting heretics, and of failing in his sacred duty as a Christian ruler. The argument was furious and bitter, and it ended with the papal legate formally excommunicating the most powerful nobleman in southern France, an act of immense political and spiritual gravity. The very next morning, the story took its fatal turn. As Pierre de Castelnau and his party were preparing to cross the Rhône River, a knight, believed to be an agent or associate of the Count, rode out from the trees. He exchanged heated words with the legate, and then he plunged a lance into the monk's side, mortally wounding him. The first blood in the conflict had been spilled, and it was the blood of the Pope's own chosen representative. Whether Count Raymond actually ordered the murder is a question historians debate to this day, but in the end, it did not matter. Pope Innocent III now had exactly what he needed. He had a martyr, and he had an unforgivable crime. The murder of a papal legate was an act of war against the Church itself. It was the final provocation, the perfect and unimpeachable justification to abandon diplomacy and to finally unleash the holy war that he had long been preparing. With the murder of his legate as the ultimate justification, Pope Innocent III unleashed the full power of his office. He issued a series of papal bulls, letters that were sent to every king, bishop, and noble in France. In them, he officially declared a crusade, a holy war, backed by the authority of God himself. But this crusade was shocking and unprecedented, for it was not directed at the enemies of the faith in a foreign land, but at the heretics of the Languedoc, at their own Christian neighbors. The Pope offered the Crusaders the greatest spiritual reward the Church could bestow, the plenary indulgence. This was the same prize offered to those who journeyed to fight in the Holy Land. It was a promise of complete forgiveness for all confessed sins, a spiritual clean slate, a guaranteed ticket to heaven that bypassed the dreaded fires of purgatory. For a violent and warlike medieval knight, conscious of his own sinfulness, this was an almost irresistible offer. But Pope Innocent offered more than just heavenly reward. He offered earthly treasure as well. He declared the lands and titles of any lord who protected or tolerated the Cathars to be forfeit, legally stripped from them. These lands were now fair game, offered up to any crusading knight who had the strength to conquer them. This transformed the Holy War into a massive, opportunistic land grab. It was a siren song for the poor, ambitious, and ruthless barons of northern France, who now saw a divinely sanctioned path to wealth and power at the expense of their southern countrymen. The Pope's call was answered with terrifying enthusiasm. From across northern France, the Rhineland, and Burgundy, thousands of men answered the call to take the cross. Some were genuinely pious. men who truly believed they were fighting to cleanse the land of a terrible evil, but many more were driven by baser motives. They were ambitious lesser nobles, landless knights, and ruthless mercenaries, who saw not a holy war, but the promise of plunder and a divinely sanctioned opportunity to seize rich new lands for themselves. This great crusading army, estimated by some contemporary sources to be tens of thousands strong, gathered near the city of Lyon in the summer of 1209. It was a massive, mobile city of war, a sea of tents and colorful banners, the air filled with the sounds of neighing war horses, the ringing of blacksmiths' hammers, and the creak of great siege engines being assembled. This was the largest and most powerful army the Languedoc had ever seen, and it was now pointed south, like a loaded crossbow aimed at the heart of their country. The lords of the south, meanwhile, were politically fractured and completely unprepared for the storm that was about to break upon them. Even Count Raymond of Toulouse, in a desperate attempt to save his own lands, submitted to a humiliating public penance and actually joined the crusade himself, at least for a time. Many of the southern nobles simply could not comprehend what was happening. In their own eyes, they were good Christians, ruling over a peaceful and prosperous land. They could not believe that an army, blessed by the Pope, was marching to destroy them, not for treason, but for tolerance. In July of 1209, the great crusading army arrived at its first major target, the prosperous and proud city of Béziers. The city was a known center of heresy, home to both a large Catholic population and many Cathar believers. The Crusaders demanded that the city hand over its listed heretics, but the leaders of Béziers, in a final, fateful act of defiance, refused to surrender their own citizens and prepared for a siege. The city was well fortified, and the southern lords expected it to hold for weeks, if not months. But the fall of Béziers was swift, chaotic, and accidental. A small band of undisciplined mercenaries, camp followers eager for plunder, saw a weakly defended gate and mounted a rash, unauthorized attack. They broke through, and seeing the breach, the main body of Crusader knights, fearing they would miss out on the spoils, stormed into the city behind them. All order was lost, and the sack of Béziers began. What followed was a scene of unrestrained horror. As the slaughter began, the knights reportedly approached the papal legate, the Cistercian abbot, Arnaud Amaury, and asked him how they were to distinguish the Cathar heretics from the good Catholics who lived alongside them. The abbot's reply has echoed through history as the very definition of religious fanaticism. Caedite eos, he supposedly said. Novit enim dominus qui sunt eos. Kill them all, for the Lord knows those who are his. And so they did. The Crusaders swept through the city, killing without distinction. Men, women, and children were cut down in the streets and in their homes. Thousands sought refuge in the city's main churches, but the sacred ground offered no protection. The doors were broken down, and the people inside were massacred. The entire city, home to perhaps as many as 20,000 souls, was put to the sword and then set ablaze. It was an act of strategic terror on an unimaginable scale, a message sent to the rest of the Languedoc: submit or suffer the same fate. After the horrific sack of Béziers, many of the great northern lords who had answered the Pope's call felt their duty was done. They had served their 40 days of crusading service, earned their indulgence, and now they returned home. This left the crusade with a smaller, more permanent army of dedicated knights and mercenaries, a force that needed a new, full-time military commander, a man with the skill and the ruthlessness to see the war through to its bitter end. That man was Simon de Montfort. He was a minor nobleman from northern France, but he was a seasoned and respected warrior, with a reputation for unbending piety and iron-willed determination. De Montfort was not a man plagued by doubt. He saw the world in stark, absolute terms. He was a devout son of the church, and he truly believed that the Cathars were servants of the devil, and that he, Simon de Montfort, had been chosen by God himself to act as the divine instrument of their destruction. But his piety was matched by his ambition. While his quest was spiritual, the rewards he sought were earthly. As a minor lord, the crusade offered him an unprecedented opportunity to carve out a new, much grander domain for himself from the conquered lands of the southern counts. This potent combination of genuine religious fanaticism and profound personal ambition made him the perfect and most terrifying leader for this new kind of holy war. He would not just defeat his enemies, he would replace them, and he would do it all in the name of God. After the horrifying example made of Béziers, the crusading army, now under the formal command of Simon de Montfort, marched on its next great objective, the mighty fortified city of Carcassonne. This was the heart of the lands belonging to the young and noble Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel, a man who, despite being a loyal Catholic himself, was known for his tolerance of the many Cathars who lived under his rule. He now found himself directly in the path of the northern tide. The siege of Carcassonne began in August of 1209. Unlike at Béziers, the defenders here were well prepared and fought back fiercely. But de Montfort's army was large and determined, and they had a powerful ally, the brutal heat of the summer sun. The Crusaders quickly took control of the two main wells that supplied the city with water, and as the August heat baked the stone walls, the thousands of citizens and refugees crowded inside began to suffer terribly from thirst and disease. Seeing the suffering of his people, the young Viscount Trencavel agreed to a parley, trusting in a promise of safe conduct from the Crusader leaders to negotiate terms. He left the safety of his city walls and went to the enemy camp to plead his case. But the Crusaders had no intention of honoring their word. During the negotiations, Trencavel was treacherously seized and thrown into his own dungeon in chains. The city was now leaderless, its defenders shocked, and their morale utterly broken. With their lord captured, the city of Carcassonne had no choice but to surrender. The citizens were given a harsh mercy. They were allowed to leave the city with their lives, but with nothing more than the clothes on their backs, exiting, naked, into the naked world. All of their homes, goods, and wealth were forfeit, and the Crusaders claimed the city for themselves. A short time later, the young Viscount died in his prison, officially of dysentery, though few in the south believed it, and the Pope officially granted all the conquered Trencavel lands, including the great city of Carcassonne, to Simon de Montfort, cementing his new role as the great lord of the crusade. The fall of Carcassonne did not end the war. It only changed its nature. The conflict devolved into a brutal, grinding, 20-year war of attrition. It was a war of countless small sieges against remote hilltop castles, a war of raids and counter-raids. Simon de Montfort's army employed scorched earth tactics, burning fields and destroying villages to break the will of the people. In response, the dispossessed southern lords, the Fadits, fought a desperate guerrilla war from the forests and mountains, a bitter struggle to reclaim their stolen lands. This long war had a devastating impact on the vibrant culture of the Languedoc. The once prosperous land was ravaged, its vineyards burned, its trade routes disrupted, and its people impoverished. The sophisticated culture of courtly love and the poetry of the troubadours could not survive in a world of constant fear and violence. The light of the Languedoc, celebrated in song for a century, was being systematically extinguished, replaced by the grim realities of religious persecution and foreign occupation. The tide of the war did shift back and forth. The southern lords, under the leadership of Count Raymond of Toulouse, eventually rallied and began to reclaim some of their territory. Simon de Montfort himself, the great hammer of the heretics, was killed in 1218 during the long and difficult siege to retake Toulouse. A rock from a catapult, supposedly operated by the women of the city, striking him down. But despite these southern victories, the war had taken its toll and had attracted the attention of a new, even more powerful player, the King of France, who now saw a perfect opportunity to break the power of the southern lords once and for all, and bring the Languedoc under the control of the French crown. By the year 1249, the open warfare of the Albigensian Crusade had finally come to an end. The great southern lords were defeated, their power broken, and their lands now firmly under the control of the French crown. A political peace, the King's Peace, settled over the ravaged Languedoc. But for the Church of Rome, the war was far from over. The crusade had succeeded in its political goal. It had destroyed the noble families who had protected the heretics. But it had failed in its spiritual goal. It had not destroyed the heresy itself. The Cathar faith had simply melted away, going underground. Its believers now practiced their faith in secret, meeting in forests, barns, and hidden cellars. The perfects became fugitives, constantly on the move. The church needed a new weapon, one that could fight not on a battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the people. That new weapon was the Papal Inquisition, formally established in the Languedoc in the 1230s to deal with the lingering Cathar faith. This was a new and terrifyingly efficient institution. It was a permanent, centralized court of inquiry, run by highly educated, highly motivated, and incorruptible specialists, often friars from the new Dominican order, who answered not to local bishops, but directly to the Pope himself. The Crusades' brute force had broken the southern lords, but it had failed to break the people's faith, and this failure led the church to forge a new, more terrifying weapon. The nature of the fear in the Languedoc changed completely. The dread of a marauding army was replaced by a more intimate and insidious paranoia. The inquisitors would arrive in a village and demand that all citizens come forward to confess their own heresy and to name the heretics among them. Neighbor was turned against neighbor, child against parent. The war was no longer fought over castle walls. It was now fought in hushed whispers, secret accusations, and the chilling silence of the interrogation chamber. The process of the Inquisition was a chilling display of bureaucratic efficiency. When an inquisitor arrived in a town or village, his first step was often to deliver an edict of grace. This was a period, typically lasting a month, during which any person guilty of heresy could come forward, voluntarily confess their sins, and receive a relatively light penance. This was a clever psychological tool. It encouraged people to come forward, and their confessions would provide the inquisitor with a web of names, a map of the secret Cathar community in the area. Once the grace period ended, the real work began. The inquisitor would summon suspects one by one, based on the denunciations he had gathered. The interrogations were methodical and relentless. A scribe recorded every question and every answer, creating a vast and detailed archive of heresy. The accused was often not told who had accused them, and they were pressed for days to reveal the names of every other heretic they had ever met, prayed with, or even shared a meal with. The goal was to unravel the entire social fabric of the faith. For those who confessed, the punishments varied. They were not always sentenced to death, but were designed to be a form of social death. Many were forced to wear 2 large yellow crosses on their outer garments for the rest of their lives, a permanent, public mark of their shame. Others were sentenced to long and dangerous pilgrimages to far-off shrines, or had their homes and property confiscated by the church. These penances served as a constant, walking warning to their neighbors, a reminder of the price of heresy. But for the unrepentant, for the Cathar perfects who refused to renounce their faith, or for the believers who relapsed into heresy after their confession, the sentence was absolute. The Inquisition itself, as a clerical court, did not shed blood. Instead, in a chilling legal fiction, it would relax the obstinate heretic to the secular arm. They would hand the condemned prisoner over to the local lord or the king's men, with a recommendation for mercy, knowing full well what would happen next. The secular authorities would then lead the heretic to a stake and burn them, allowing the church to maintain the illusion of having clean hands, while acting as the engine of the execution. Under the crushing weight of the Inquisition, the organized Cathar Church shattered and reformed into a secret, underground network. The great bishops could no longer meet in council, and the perfects could no longer preach openly in the towns. They became fugitives in their own land, traveling in disguise as craftsmen or wool merchants, moving constantly from one safe house to the next, their lives a testament to a faith that refused to die. This was a life of constant fear and extreme hardship. The perfects hid in remote forest huts, in mountain caves, or in the cellars of loyal believers. To be discovered was a death sentence, and to shelter a perfect was a crime punishable by the loss of all property, and often life itself. Every knock at the door, every stranger on the road, was a potential threat. The entire community was held together by whispers, secret signs, and a web of incredible bravery. And yet, the believers continued to risk everything for one all-important reason: the consolamentum. The entire underground network was geared towards this single purpose: to ensure that when a faithful credant was on their deathbed, a message could be smuggled out, and a perfect, a good man or good woman, would travel for days, risking capture at every turn, simply to arrive at that bedside, to perform the final, saving sacrament, and to guarantee that one more soul would find its way home. As the Inquisitor's net tightened across the Languedoc, the fugitive Cathars, both believers and perfects, needed one last haven, one final fortress where they could live their faith in safety. They found it high in the Pyrenees mountains of Ariège, in the remote and formidable castle of Montségur, the Safe Mountain. Perched atop a sheer, isolated limestone peak known as a pog, Montségur was a natural fortress. Its dizzying cliffs and steep approaches made it almost impregnable to a conventional military assault. For years, It served as a beacon of resistance, a place of refuge for dispossessed knights, fugitive perfects, and believers who refused to submit to the authority of the Church of Rome or the King of France. But Montségur became more than just a military outpost. It became the unofficial capital, the spiritual heart of the hunted Cathar Church. Within its walls lived a large and vibrant community of some of the most important remaining perfects. They ministered to a population of soldiers, refugees, and their families. It was the last place on earth where the Cathar faith could be practiced openly. To its enemies, it was a nest of vipers, the synagogue of Satan. But to the faithful, it was the last sanctuary of the good Christians, their final eagle's nest against a hostile world. For years, the French crown and the church had tolerated the defiant stronghold of Montségur. But by the spring of 1243, their patience had run out. A massive royal army, numbering perhaps as many as 10,000 men, was dispatched with one final objective: to erase this last nest of heretics from the map. The army surrounded the base of the mountain, and the final great siege of the Albigensian Crusade began. Inside the fortress, a garrison of around 100 soldiers, along with over 400 civilians, including many of the most important surviving Cathar perfects, prepared for the assault. In the initial months, their position seemed secure. The mountain's steep, treacherous cliffs made a direct, large-scale attack almost impossible. The French army could do little more than blockade the base and bombard the fortress from afar with their great stone-throwing engines. A constant, grinding war of attrition that lasted through the long summer. The turning point came during the dead of winter. The attackers realized that the only way to take the fortress was to first conquer the smaller watchtower, or Barbican, located on the eastern side of the peak. In a feat of incredible daring, a small party of Basque mountaineers, specialists hired by the Royal Army, undertook a secret nighttime ascent, scaling the supposedly impassable eastern cliff face. Under the cover of darkness, they overwhelmed the small guard post and established a foothold for the French on the summit itself. With this new position secured, the French army was able to haul a great trebuchet up the mountainside. Now they could bombard the main fortress, the castrum, at close range. Day after day, great stones crashed against the walls, shattering the defenses that had seemed so strong. The small garrison of defenders fought back with desperate courage, but they were exhausted, starving, and now their walls were beginning to crumble around them. But before the final surrender, a strange and legendary event took place. In the dead of night, just days before the fortress was to be handed over, 4 Cathar perfects were secretly lowered down the steepest and most dangerous side of the mountain on ropes. They carried with them a mysterious and important cargo, disappearing into the darkness to be spirited away by guides waiting in the valley below. This was the famous escape of the Cathar treasure. For centuries, this event has fueled romantic legends, tales of the Holy Grail, lost Templar gold, or ancient scrolls containing the secret wisdom of Christ himself. The historical reality, however, was likely something more practical, but no less precious to the doomed faith. The treasure was almost certainly the Cathar's own sacred books, their copies of the Gospels, along with whatever money and valuables they had managed to save. A final, desperate effort to provide the few surviving fugitives with the spiritual and material resources they would need to continue their ministry in the shadows. The terms of the surrender were simple and brutal. The soldiers who had defended the fortress and the lay people who had taken refuge there would be granted mercy by the king's men. Their lives would be spared. But for the Cathar perfects, the good Christians, there was no mercy unless they renounced their faith and submitted themselves to the judgment of the Inquisition. Any perfect who refused was sentenced to be burned at the stake. But then, a strange and remarkable request was made, and granted. The Cathars asked for a truce of 2 weeks. A 15-day armistice after the surrender had already been agreed upon. For 15 days, the fighting stopped completely. The French army waited patiently at the foot of the mountain, while inside the fortress, the community of the doomed calmly and methodically began to prepare for their own deaths. These last days were not spent in fear or despair. They were spent in prayer and spiritual preparation. But something incredible also happened. During this truce, a number of the remaining believers and even some of the soldiers of the garrison came forward and asked to receive the consolamentum. They chose, at the last possible moment, to be elevated to the rank of perfect, knowing full well that in doing so, they were choosing to die in the fire. In this final act of defiance, the Church of the Cathars did not shrink. It grew, gaining new saints in the very shadow of the pyre. On the morning of March 16th, 1244, the 2-week truce came to an end. The gates of Montségur opened one last time, and a solemn procession began. More than 200 people, the long-serving perfects and those newly consecrated in the final days, walked out of the fortress that had been their last home and began their final descent down the mountain. They did not weep, they did not resist, they walked willingly to their fate. At the foot of the mountain, the French army had constructed a huge pyre, a massive pile of wood surrounded by a wooden stockade. The area would forever after be known as the Prat dels Cremats, the field of the burned. The perfects, 2 by 2, were led to the enclosure, and without being chained or forced, they climbed onto the pyre, choosing their own place within the wood that would become their final earthly vessel. The fire was then lit. For the crusaders who watched, this was the triumphant end of a great evil, a righteous purification of the land from a terrible heresy. But for the Cathars, and for the memory of the Languedoc, this was something else entirely. It was not an execution. It was a mass martyrdom, a final, triumphant act of will, a collective good death. In one single, terrible, and glorious moment, more than 200 perfected souls cast off their fleshy prisons together and began their final journey home, back to the kingdom of light. The fall of Montségur was the death blow to the Cathar Church as an organized religion, but it was not the end of the faith itself. For another 75 years, a handful of fugitive perfects continued to wander the remote mountain valleys of the Pyrenees, ministering in secret to the last scattered communities of believers, a ghost church haunted by the memory of what it had lost. To hunt down these last stubborn embers of heresy, the church deployed a new kind of inquisitor. His name was Jacques Fournier, the Bishop of Pamiers. Fournier was not a man of fire and sword. He was a brilliant scholar, a patient administrator, and a relentlessly methodical interrogator. His goal was not simply to punish the heretics. It was to understand them completely, to map out every facet of their theology, their rituals, and their secret networks in order to ensure that not a single root of the heresy was left in the ground. Between the years 1318 and 1325, Fournier placed the entire region under his microscope, and he had his scribes record every single word of his interrogations. The result is the document known as the Fournier Register, a massive and unprecedentedly detailed record of the lives of the last Cathars. In a profound historical irony, the very tool designed to ensure the faith's complete destruction has now become our single greatest source of knowledge about it, a window into the daily lives, the fears, the hopes, and the beliefs of a people on the verge of extinction, preserved forever by the pen of the man who hunted them. Thanks to the incredible detail of the Fournier Register, we know more about the daily lives of the residents of one small village, Montaillou, than almost any other peasant community in the Middle Ages. Fournier's records transform the last Cathars from anonymous heretics into living, breathing people with families, fears, and a faith they were willing to die for. Montaillou was one of the last bastions of the Cathar faith, a village of the accused. The register reveals that this was not a village with a few heretics hiding from a Catholic majority. The entire social fabric of Montaillou was interwoven with the good faith. Shepherds would guide fugitive perfects through secret mountain passes. Farmers would leave food at designated drop-off points, and powerful families would provide shelter and resources. Even the local Catholic priest, Pierre Clergue, was secretly a believer and a key figure in the network, using his position to protect his flock. The records also reveal the central and heroic role of women in preserving the faith. While the perfects were mostly men at this late stage, it was the women of the village who ran the network. They were the keepers of the safe houses. They smuggled messages, food, and money. And they were the ones who taught the Cathar prayers and stories to their children, ensuring the faith was passed down even when the preachers could not be present. They were the silent, steadfast heart of the resistance. But it was this tight-knit community that Jacques Fournier so skillfully dismantled. Through his relentless interrogations, he slowly and methodically turned neighbor against neighbor. Using the threat of punishment and the promise of lighter penance, he pressured people to confess and to denounce their own friends and family. The bonds of faith and kinship that had held the community together for generations were shattered by the institutionalized paranoia of the Inquisition until the entire network was exposed and ready to be destroyed. The meticulous work of Jacques Fournier's Inquisition had all but destroyed the faith in the Languedoc. But one last perfect of note still remained. His name was Guillaume Bélibaste. He was not a perfect saint. He was a flawed, complicated man who had even fathered a child, breaking his sacred vow. Fleeing the Inquisition, he lived for years as a fugitive in Catalonia, the spiritual leader of a tiny, dwindling community of exiles. He was the last known apostolic successor to the Cathar Church. His end came not through discovery, but through betrayal. A spy working for the Inquisition, a man named Arnaud Sicre, spent years integrating himself into the community of exiles. He gained Bélibaste's trust, pretending to be a devout believer. Finally, in 1321, Sicre convinced the aging perfect that a wealthy woman back in the Languedoc wished to receive the consolamentum, promising a rich reward for the church. He lured Bélibaste back across the Pyrenees, directly into a trap. Bélibaste was captured and delivered to the Archbishop of Narbonne. As a relapsed heretic, his fate was sealed. He was condemned and taken to the castle of Villarouge-Termenès to be executed. As he was tied to the stake, he is said to have uttered a final defiant prophecy. "In 700 years," he cried to the crowd, "the laurel will be green again." The fire was then lit, and the last known Cathar perfect in the Languedoc was burned to ashes. With his death in the autumn of 1321, the apostolic succession of the Cathar Church was broken, and the living faith was finally, truly lost. The Inquisition's ultimate goal was total annihilation, to erase not only the Cathars' bodies, but their very memory from the earth. Yet, in a profound historical paradox, it was the Inquisition's own obsessive drive for documentation, its meticulous registers of confession and condemnation, that ultimately failed in this task. The pen of the man who hunted the last Cathars to extinction is the very reason we can, centuries later, tell their story and give voice to the lost religion of the good Christians. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the world of the Cathars. My mission is to continue exploring these complex and often overlooked stories from our past. If you'd like to be a part of this journey and not miss the next story, I would be honored if you would subscribe to the channel. As always, thank you for your time and attention.